Buy Black Podcast, Episode 9. If you support the NFL protests and boycotts, but you're not promoting and supporting Black-owned businesses, you're wasting your time. Welcome to Buy Black, the only podcast dedicated to helping you find, connect with, and support Black-owned businesses. We're on a mission to bring consumers and business owners together to ignite the global Black economy. I'm your host, Gerald Jones, and if you're a Black business owner or a socially conscious consumer, you've joined the right community. Ready? Let's get to work. Hey guys, welcome back to Buy Black, your only show dedicated to connecting you with Black business owners in order to help you direct your dollars back into the Black community. This week's episode is going to be a little bit different and a little bit off the cuff. I know we normally don't go politics on this one, but I'm going to get a little bit of political in this episode. And hopefully by the end of it, it'll make sense and it'll tie back in to the Buy Black focus that we have on this show. So this weekend, I have been completely out of pocket. We had a really close friend get married this weekend down in Arkansas. So the last 3 days have just been a complete it's been crazy. I drove 10 hours on Friday to get down there, drove 2 hours on Saturday to get to the wedding, spent a lot of time hanging out, having fun at the wedding, then drove 2 hours to go back to where we were staying, got up this morning, drove 10 hours to get back home, and now it is about 11:15 p.m. Central Time, and I'm here to record this episode for tomorrow morning because guess what? The show must go on. Now, while this weekend was happening, I was mostly unplugged, but I did get a chance to take a look at a little bit of Facebook and a little bit of Twitter today, and I was really happy with what I saw. Apparently, the Twitter Commander-in-Chief, which, again, not saying the name here, decided to weigh in on the protests, on the NFL player protests of the national anthem, and I love it when he does what he does, because a lot of times when people are on the fence, this guy opens his mouth and people suddenly realize what side of the fence they should be on, the opposite side from him. So things were said, people were called sons of bees, and suddenly today we saw many more players taking a knee. We saw players, coaches, linking arms in solidarity with this protest, some taking a knee, some not, but ultimately a huge rush of support within the league for these player protests. And that really made me excited about where this is going. And then, of course, also we still have folks like myself who are normal spectators who've decided to boycott and aren't watching any of the games this year. And I saw some conversations around that. People, saying, hey, we're in a conundrum now. Do I not watch because I want to stand in solidarity with Cap, or do I watch because now we have all of these players and coaches who are they're protesting? I think I even saw that someone who sang the national anthem today ended it by taking a knee and throwing the black fist of power up into the air. So I mean, there's a lot going on within the league that is watchworthy in support of this protest. And so I just saw that conversation going, and it seems like the discussion is growing, which is absolutely great. What I wanted to do tonight is I wanted to cover a few things. The first thing, I wanted to draw people back to the reason why this protest is happening in the first place. Nothing that nobody's ever heard before. I'm just going to reference back to this Harvard working paper that was released last year, just shortly after Alton Sterling and Philando Castile were killed. And I'm just going to reiterate a few of the findings inside that working paper. And then I also found another blog post from Harvard, which is where this working paper came out of, that was a rebuttal to the findings of the working paper. If you guys hadn't heard, this working paper, it was talked about as a study, like a Harvard study. It wasn't a study. It was just a working paper. It was just a work in progress. But it basically found, supposedly, that there's no racial bias in police shootings, but there is racial bias in the way that police do everything else up to shooting. But I found a rebuttal paper to this as well, or at least in a blog, that I want to read to you guys after I go over some of the short findings from this research that kind of goes over a lot of the reasons why we are protesting in the first place and we are boycotting in the first place. And then I want to follow that up by encouraging you guys to look at this protest for what it actually is supposed to be and not be short-sighted with it and only supporting the protest but not going the next step. So that's really what this show is going to be about. I'm going to try to keep it simple and straightforward for you. So with that, I want to go directly into talking about what it is that we're protesting. Why are we here in the first place? And so referencing back to that study, the study itself, it was called, and again, I'm calling it a study now, is a working paper. It was not a study, but it was a working paper that was called An Empirical Analysis of Racial Differences in Police Use of Force. And it was conducted by Roland Fryer at Harvard, and he conducted this study, or he was in the middle of conducting this study. It's actually a working paper for the National Bureau of Economic Research. So I know the New York Times called it a study. I keep using the word study because it's just so easy, but it's not. It's not a completed work. It was just a working paper. It's not peer reviewed. It is not. It is in no way complete scientific work that is ready for the world to consume. It was just really convenient to put it out at that time, and all the news media outlets just sucked it up, called it a study, and a lot of them just took the face of it and said, oh, look, see, no racial bias, because this quote-unquote study says there wasn't. But here's the reality of what that working paper did find. And I'm pulling information directly from the New York Times in an article that was dated July 11, 2016. And it is called Surprising New Evidence Shows Bias in Police Use of Force, but Not in Shootings. And I'm going to give you guys just some specifics about what was found in this working paper. All right, so some of the basics. Police officers are more likely to, and again, a lot of this information comes from studies from New York, studies from, I believe, Florida, studies from Texas, I think Houston, Texas. But in this information, it says that police officers are more likely to put their hands on black people than white people at a rate of 17%, more likely to push black people into a wall than white people at a rate of 18% more likely, 16% more likely to handcuff black people, 19% more likely to draw their weapon when interacting with a black person, 18% more likely to push a black person to the ground, 24% more likely to point their weapon at a black person during an interaction, and 25% more likely to use pepper spray or a baton on a black person than a white person during an interaction. This is just the basic overall findings from this working paper, which again, not a completed work. So then looking at use of force information in stops of compliant citizens in New York City. So this is data saying that suspects who complied with officers' directions, did not verbally threaten police officers, were not arrested, and were not found with weapons or contraband. In those situations, police were 21% more likely to put their hands on a black person, 17% more likely to push them into a wall, 13% more likely to handcuff us, 10% more likely to draw a weapon, 8% more likely to push us to the ground, 7% more likely to point a gun at us, and then 14% less likely to use pepper spray or a baton in those situations. And so this is compliant citizens in New York City. The person had absolutely no threatening posture at all, and yet for black people in all categories except one, they were more likely to escalate in some way and use force against us. There's a lot of other information that came out of this study, but the one key thing that a lot of conservative news media outlets focused on was that it did not find a quote-unquote racial bias in police shootings of unarmed people, okay? So in that one very specific key category, it didn't find racial bias in those police shootings. I'm focusing on that term racial bias because when we as normal people just look at these, we think about racial bias in our terms, right? As just a pejorative term that is a generalized term for anything that we would consider to be stereotyping or bias or anything like that. When you talk about looking at studies and people doing scientific research, every word they use has a specific definition that must fit within the confines of the study or the research being done. And so based on this researcher's use of the term racial bias, there was another doctoral candidate at Harvard who spends a majority of his time doing work on monitoring police violence with injury and mortality data, examining associations between various health outcomes and economic and racial residential segregation, and using multi-level models and census-derived variables to analyze population-based health data. These are the main things that this other doctoral candidate at Harvard focuses on. His name is Justin Feldman, and he wrote a blog article shortly after this data was released called "Roland Fryer is Wrong. There is racial bias in shootings by police," and it was dated July 12, 2016. And if you guys don't mind, I'm going to read this entire thing for you because it helps to understand why, one, whenever a new study comes out, even if it is peer-reviewed, there is often some type of bias inside the study itself, even if the study is about bias. And so if you don't read counter articles or other opinions from other people in the field on how those studies were conducted and you just take them at face value, you can often miss a lot of information. And so I can't tell you that this guy's rebuttal is 100% correct, but it does shed a little bit of light on the original study itself and other ways to look at this data. And so I'll just go ahead and read it for you now. So Roland Fryer is wrong. There is racial bias in shootings by police. All right, Roland Fryer, an economics professor at Harvard University, recently published a working paper at NBER on the topic of racial bias in police use of force and police shootings. The paper gained substantial media attention. A write-up of it became the top-viewed article on the New York Times website. The most notable part of the study was its finding that there was no evidence of racial bias in police shootings, which Fryer called the most surprising result of his career. In his analysis of shootings in Houston, Texas, Black and Hispanic people were no more likely, and perhaps even less likely, to be shot relative to whites. Fryer's analysis is highly flawed, however. It suffers from major theoretical and methodological errors, and he has communicated the results to news media in a way that is misleading. While there have been long problems with the quality of police shootings data, there is still plenty of evidence to support a pattern of systematic, racially discriminatory use of force against Black people in the United States. Next headline, breaking down the analysis of police shootings in Houston. There should be no argument that Black and Latino people in Houston are more likely to be shot by police compared to whites. I looked at the same Houston police shooting data set as Fryer for the years of 2005 to 2015, which I supplemented with census data, and I found that Black people were over 5 times as likely to be shot relative to whites. Latinos were roughly twice as likely to be shot versus whites. Fryer was not comparing rates of police shootings by race, however. Instead, his research asked whether these racial differences were the result of racial bias, in quotes, rather than merely statistical discrimination, also in quotes. Both terms have specific meanings in economics. Statistical discrimination occurs when an individual or institution treats people differently based on racial stereotypes that truly reflect the average behavior of a racial group. So I'll translate that. Statistical discrimination is basically, yes, we profiled you, but we profiled you based directly proportionately to how often you actually do things more likely. So what it's kind of saying is that, hey, we stop 50% more Black people on suspicion of shoplifting because statistics have shown us that Black people can commit 50% more of the shoplifting offenses than white people. So that's basically what statistical discrimination is I'm discriminating, but only based on the fact that statistics have shown that this is the proportion that you are more likely to do this, which he'll explain this more here in a second, and maybe he'll do better than me. But that's how I understand statistical discrimination. So I'll continue here. For instance, if a city's Black drivers are 50% more likely to possess drugs than white drivers, and police officers are 50% more likely to pull over Black drivers, economic theory would hold that this discriminatory policing is rational. If, however, police were to pull over black drivers at a rate that disproportionately exceeded their likelihood of drug possession, that would be an irrational behavior representing individual or institutional bias. Once again, it is possible to find the idea of statistical discrimination just as abhorrent as racial bias. One could point out that the drug laws police enforce were passed with racially discriminatory intent, that collectively punishing black people based on average behavior is wrong, or that as a self-fulfilling prophecy, bias can turn into statistical discrimination. If black people's cars are searched more thoroughly, for instance, then it will appear that their rates of drug possession are higher. At the same time, studies assessing the extent of racial bias above and beyond statistical discrimination have been able to secure legal victories for civil rights. An analysis of Stop and Frisk by Jeffrey Fagan, which found evidence of racial bias, was an important part of the court case against the NYPD and helped secure an injunction against the policy. Even if one accepts the logic of statistical discrimination versus racial bias, it is an inappropriate choice for a study of police shootings. The method that Fryer employs has, for the most part, been used to study traffic stops and stop and frisk practices. In those cases, economic theory holds that police want to maximize the number of arrests for the possession of contraband, such as drugs or weapons, while expending the fewest resources. If they are acting in the most cost-efficient, rational manner, the police may use racial stereotypes to increase the arrest rate per stop. This theory completely falls apart for police shootings, however, because officers are not trying to rationally maximize the number of shootings. The theory that is supposed to be informing Fryer's choice of methods is therefore not applicable to this case. He seems somewhat aware of this issue. In his interview with the New York Times, he attributes his surprising finding to an issue of costs, legal and psychological, that happened following a shooting. In what is perhaps a case of cognitive dissonance, he seems to not have reflected on whether the question of cost renders his choice of methods invalid. Economic theory aside, there is an even more fundamental problem with the Houston police shooting analysis. In a typical study, a researcher will start with a previously defined population where each individual is at risk of a particular outcome. For instance, a population of drivers stopped by police can have one of two outcomes. They can be arrested or they can be sent on their way. Instead of following this standard approach, Fryer constructs a fictitious population of people who are shot by police and people who are arrested. The problem here is that these two groups, those shot and those arrested, are in all likelihood systematically different from one another in ways that cannot be controlled for statistically. Fryer acknowledges this limitation in a brief footnote, but understates just how problematic it is. Properly interpreted, the actual result from Fryer's analysis is that the racial disparity in arrest rates is larger than the racial disparity in police shootings. This is an unsurprising finding and proves neither a lack of bias nor a lack of systematic discrimination. Even if the difference in the arrest versus shooting groups could be accounted for, Fryer tries to control these differences using variables in police reports, such as if the suspect was described as violently resisting arrest. There is reason to believe that these police reports themselves are racially biased. An investigation of people charged with assaulting a police officer in Washington, D.C. found that this charge was applied disproportionately towards black residents, even for situations in which no assault actually occurred. This was partly due to an overly broad definition of assault against police in D.C. law, but the principle that police are likely to describe black civilians as more threatening is applicable to other jurisdictions. I'll also briefly note that there was another analysis using data from multiple cities that looked at racial differences in whether or not civilians attacked officers before they were shot. Fryer himself downplays the credibility of this analysis because it relied on reports from police who had every incentive to misrepresent the order of events. Final headline, racial inequality in police shootings. Fryer's study is far from the first to investigate racial bias or discrimination in police shootings. A number of studies have placed officers in shooting simulators, and most have shown a greater propensity for shooting black civilians relative to whites. Other research has found that cities with black mayors and city councilors have lower rates of police shootings than would otherwise be expected. A recent analysis of national data showed wide variation in racial disparities for police shooting rates between counties, and these differences were not associated with racial differences in crime rates. This is just a small sample of the dozens of studies on police killing published since the 1950s, most of which suggest that racial bias is indeed a problem. It is a failure of journalism that the New York Times heavily promoted this study without seeking critical perspectives from experts in the field. Fryer makes basic methodological errors, overstates the quality of his results, and casually uses the term racial bias in a way that is nearly guaranteed to be misinterpreted by anyone who isn't an economist. So the gist of that rebuttal is what we already know, right? That black people are statistically more likely to be dealt with in a escalation of force type of way with police officers, whether we are compliant or non-compliant, whether we are an actual threat or just a perceived threat or just a guy who fits the description. Even this study, which doesn't accurately look at a sample or a population in a way that controls for all the variables, still came out with both civilians and police officers reporting that every form of escalation of force that could be applied to any population is going to be applied to black people more than both whites and Hispanics. In other words, black bodies matter less, black rights matter less, black lives matter less than other people's lives in this country. And that is exactly what we're boycotting for, right? That's exactly what Colin Kaepernick is not getting a job for, right? Because he started this protest that is now growing, and all the people who are in the league protesting and all of us who are not watching protesting and boycotting are all doing that because in every statistical demographic possible that you can look at, black lives are treated as worth less than every other type of life that exists here in the United States, to include the lives of dogs. They get treated better than us. They get treated with more empathy and sympathy than us, right? Gorillas in the zoo get treated with more empathy and sympathy than us when violence occurs against them. We all know this. And this is what the protest and the boycott is about. And I'm all for that. But here's where I have a problem. If that's where you stop, if not watching an NFL game, not buying an NFL jersey, not supporting the NFL, air quotes, is where you stop, then you're wasting your time. Because nothing changes in our community if we win the fight in this protest. You got to think about the logical conclusion of this, all right? Let's think best case scenario of what comes out of this NFL protest. One, NFL owners, coaches, managers, they all get on board and they say, we support the right of our players to protest. We support Black Lives Matter. We're going to start directing our money and our energy and our influence to helping to bring light to this situation in the community. Colin Kaepernick can get a job and everybody goes back to watching the NFL. That's best case scenario. And even in that best case scenario, you now have a counter protest that's going to start from all the angry racist people who are like, well, now we ain't watching the NFL. And they got a lot more of them and a lot more money. And things might get reversed. But we're not even going to go down that road. All right, we're going to leave that variable out. Best case scenario happens with the NFL. What changes for the black community? What changes for black men and women in their neighborhoods across this country? Does the interaction with police change? I doubt it. If a police officer or a civilian feels threatened by the presence of a black person because that person just happened to be there, they were threatened, and so they decided they needed to take that person's life, does that police officer or that civilian now get, what's that word I'm looking for? Convicted? I doubt it, because the politics haven't changed. And why haven't the politics changed? Because we still have no power. We still have no power in the community, right? Like, oh, we had the power to make the NFL break down and say, yes, we support you. Great. But how many politicians do we control, right? How many of our businesses in our own neighborhoods do we own? How many of the pieces of property in black neighborhoods or outside of black neighborhoods do we own? Where is the wealth that we're going to use to get sway and influence in the community? It doesn't exist. So we all come together and we get the NFL to buckle to its knees and say, fine, this guy can have a job and we support our players kneeling wherever they want to kneel. Wonderful. But we're still in the same boat. So I say to you, if you're going to put your energy into promoting a boycott and you're going to put your energy into supporting that boycott and sending your dollars and your time somewhere else. Don't just look at the next organization down the street that's still completely outside the black community and say, well, these folks are neutral and I like their products, so I'm going to spend my money here now. The dollars are still not staying in the black community. The wealth is still not being built in the black community. You're basically taking your dollars away from this group of billionaires and you're giving them to this other group of billionaires. Neither one actually has your best interest in heart because they're not part of your community. So we've accomplished nothing. If you're supporting this protest, if you're out promoting this protest, you need to be promoting black-owned businesses just as hard or harder. You need to be supporting black-owned businesses just as fervently as you are supporting people taking a knee for the national anthem. Because directing dollars into our community, directing those funds and that wealth-building power into the community is how we're going to eventually be able to gain the political clout that is needed in order to make people actually pay attention in a way that matters for us. Right now they're paying attention because they're angry that we're taking a knee during a song. But they need to be paying attention because we're angry and we're not going to let them have access to our money anymore. We're not going to let them have access to our culture anymore. We're not going to let them have access to our community anymore. Those politicians who want to keep their power, we're not going to support them anymore. And we have the money and the backing and the power in our own community to get our own other candidates who do care about us, not just the ones who say they do, but get in and never work for our benefit, but candidates who actually do care about us, get them in office and actually make change. When we have the money to change who is in the seat of power at the local level, at the state level, even at the federal level, guess what you'll start seeing? Convictions when we're violated. Convictions when our men, women, and children are murdered. And convictions is all it's going to take. Honestly, that's what we need to be working for. We need to be working towards a conviction, because that first conviction is going to be the one that's going to make people say, okay, maybe it's not time to escalate, because now I'm going to lose my life. I'm going to lose the rest of my life to jail time because apparently these black people are important enough to warrant a little bit of respect now. But until we get that first real conviction, and then a second, and then a third, we're still going to have a target on our back, and people are going to know they can get away with it. And the only way we're going to eventually get to the point of getting those convictions is being in a position to have the political clout to demand it, because people know that they will actually see a real financial and power backlash if we don't get it. It doesn't take much, but we haven't even crossed that threshold yet. And I guarantee you, just not watching an NFL game or taking a knee during the national anthem is not going to get us across that conviction finish line. It's having the money and the power in our community to demand it and win. And that doesn't happen until we start directing our dollars to black-owned businesses on purpose. Now, nothing about this is saying don't ever buy from anybody who's not black-owned. But you need to look for black-owned businesses first. If you can't find what you're looking for, fine. Go get what you need. But look to support a black-owned business in your local community, and then in your region, and then nationally, and then globally first. And if you can't find what you need, okay, great. Go to any other option. But change your habits to where you are promoting and supporting black-owned businesses first. If you're serious about this protest, if you're serious about this boycott, then you need to get serious about buying black. That's all I have for this episode tonight. As I said before, I've got another interview with a great black business owner coming for you next Monday. And I'll give you a quick preview. You really want to tune in to this one to listen to Jamel talk about her products. She took a scientific approach to creating natural hair care products for multiple different types of hair. I mean, we're talking dreadlocks, we're talking kinky curly hair, we're talking hair regrowth, beard, everything. She took the scientific background that she had and her experience as a hairdresser. She put those two things together and she created this incredible line of products that I'm looking forward to sharing with you guys this coming Monday. Again, it's called Phoenix Deep Rooted. And if you want to get a heads up on that before that episode comes out, you can find her at phoenixdeeprooted.com. That is PhoenixDeeprooted.com. PhoenixDeeprooted.com. But you will hear Jamil and her episode next Monday. Today, to close this episode out, a few housekeeping items that I want to share with you guys. First, we have a new 5-star review coming in from CC Phila. This one came in. It says, so necessary, 5 stars. Now more than ever, it should be plain that only Black people can rescue Black people. We have to help ourselves. In its short existence, this unique podcast has given us great insight from current Black business owners, little known history about previous Black-owned businesses, and ideas for the future of Black business. We must support. Hey, CC Phila, I really appreciate that review. And for the rest of you out there listening to these episodes, if you can jump into iTunes for me, leave us a 5-star rating or review. I will happily read them on air. I love to hear what you guys have to say, and I'm also always looking for feedback on how I can make the show better for you. The next thing I want to hit, again, we have the Facebook community. It is Buy Black Podcast Community on Facebook. Join that community group. It's there for you. In that group, you can post about your own Black-owned business. You can promote yourself in the group. I know a lot of groups out there, they don't like self-promotion and all that kind of stuff. That's not what this is about. This is all about you. So if you join the Buy Black Podcast community over on Facebook, if you have a business that you want to promote, put it up there. Share it with everybody. I really want to help grow this group and give people the opportunity to share with each other directly about their Black-owned businesses and have a resource that people can actually go and find products and services that they may need. Next thing I have, the website. Contacted my web developer this weekend. He's got another revision of the website that he shot over to me. So I'm going to be taking a look at that this week, getting with him, getting some final touches and things on the website. And then we're going to be ready to go very, very soon. And then the very last thing that I want to hit you guys with tonight, as always, please do me a favor. And as you're listening to this episode in your podcast app, if you found the information that we shared tonight useful and helpful, just go ahead, click on the share button. It should be right there on your phone. And I don't care if it's Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever you spend the most of your time, you have the biggest following, or you feel like people are hanging out that need to get this information. Just click that share button. If it's on Facebook or Twitter, you can tag me at Buy Black Podcast. I'd love to see that, and I will retweet or share on my page as well from you. Other than that, guys, I really appreciate you joining me for this episode of Buy Black. I will see you next week with our next episode. Thank you for being part of the Buy Black Podcast community. If you're enjoying the show, I'd appreciate reading your 5-star review in iTunes. Join us next time for another empowering episode.